natural resources. And we'd like to bring some light to this issue and which would make for a better level playing field. So, so the National Organic Program requires that operators maintain or improve their natural resources of the operation, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife, and to conserve biodiversity. And in 2016, the NOP published Natural Resource and Biodiversity Guidance. It's a 9-page document that includes lots of examples, including these here, such as protecting riparian areas, supporting native species and habitat, minimizing invasive species, maintaining air quality, promoting crop diversity and plant condition, and improving soil condition. The guidance also clarifies that organic farmers must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, and certifiers have a responsibility to verify that those operators are in compliance with this requirement. Organic consumers expect that they are getting pesticide-free food and that it is environmental friendly. But that's not always the case. There are some great models of farms that are conserving biodiversity. And there's other farms where the certifiers are turning a blind eye to the situation. We have riparian areas that are conserved to protect wildlife, to support all kinds of biodiversity, and other farms where they are farming right up to the edge. And not only is there no biodiversity, it's impacting the water resources. So today we're going to hear from 4 speakers, including myself. Jessica Shade from the Organic Center is going to help highlight some science as it relates to biodiversity, how critical biodiversity is for the farm. Next, we'll hear from Peter Martinelli of Fresh Run Farm. He's going to talk about how biodiversity helps his farm function. Then we'll hear from Sean Feeder of CCOF. He's going to talk about how they have been making improvements to their systems so that farms are addressing biodiversity in the organic system plan, which is the form farmers fill out, and also how they have really updated their inspection form that the inspectors fill out. And I think this is a really good form that others may want to consider emulating, although there may be others out there besides what CCOF is doing. And then lastly, I will speak about a new publication we have that can help better support certifiers and inspectors on this issue.
Hi, everyone. I am Jessica Shade. I'm the Director of Science Programs for the Organic Center. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Organic Center, we are a nonprofit organization, and we kind of have 2 main goals. One is to communicate science that happens all over the world to organic stakeholders. And then on the other side of things, we also collaborate with academic and governmental institutions to fill research gaps in our knowledge. And I'm so excited to be a part of this panel because I love getting a chance to talk about biodiversity. It's such a critical component of a functioning ecosystem. And that means that it's essential for healthy organic farms. But sometimes it gets pushed out of the limelight because there are so many other environmental disasters happening at the same time. But as we're thinking about organic or even ecosystem services in general, we have to keep in mind that everything we talk about is connected to biodiversity. We can't talk about crop yields without talking about pollinator populations. We can't talk about invasive pests without thinking about beneficial parasitoids. We can't talk about soil health without thinking about below ground ecology. So it really all comes back to biodiversity. And biodiversity isn't just a critical component of a healthy ecosystem. A sink in biodiversity is also an indicator for other ecosystem service collapses. So it's really all connected. And I'll start by talking about the general trend of biodiversity in organic, because it's one of the few happy stories that we have out there, and we need as many positive stories as we can get right now. But first, I'll give a really quick primer on the definition of biodiversity within a healthy community. So I borrowed this figure from Professor David Crowder at Washington State University, because I think he does a lovely job of diagramming these different concepts within biodiversity. So these are some of the things that we're looking for when it comes to biodiversity within a healthy community. So the top left quadrant of the figure shows species abundance. And basically, this is the amount of a single species. In general, more abundance is better, but it's really just focusing on the numbers, which can all be a single species. So in this diagram, there's one type of bee that goes from low abundance to high abundance. And then in the upper right quadrant of the figure, you'll see species richness. And this is the amount of unique species. And the more unique species, the better. And then in the lower left quadrant, that shows stability. So this is the variation in abundance over time. So if one year you had very few species, and then the next year you have many, many species, that's low stability versus a consistent number of species, which is high stability. And low stability can be bad for productivity, so higher stability is better. And then finally, the lower right quadrant of the figure looks at species evenness. So this is the distribution of balance between the different organisms. So if you have 5 different species of bees on your farm, but most of them are from a single species, that's low evenness. And now if there are about the same number of individuals of each of those 5 species, then that's high evenness, which is what we're looking for in a healthy community. And when it comes to organic farms, what's encouraging is that on average, research shows that they have higher biodiversity, especially higher species abundance, richness, and evenness than conventional farms. I've seen studies showing this with multiple different organisms. So some of the ones that I list here are beetles, spiders, earthworms, beneficial parasitoids, vascular plants, birds, honeybees, native pollinators, small rodents, even soil microbes and fungi. And there are even studies showing that organic farms can help their nearby conventional neighbors, because biodiversity increases don't stop at the organic farm boundary. They actually have positive impacts on the biodiversity levels of nearby conventional farms. But I've also heard some stress when it comes to increased biodiversity on organic farms, especially from conventional neighboring farms, because there's this myth that most of the biodiversity that organic harbors is in the form of pests that can then be a problem for conventional farms. And this is one that's actually a hot topic in the scientific world, because the increase in biodiversity on organic farms that I've been talking about is pretty well supported. So now researchers were curious that if biodiversity increase was going on in organic farms, was it because of higher numbers of pests? And what they found is that organic farms do support more insect species than conventional, but that increase is actually led by pollinators and beneficial predators, things like parasitoid wasps and lady beetles. So in this graph, that dotted line at 0 is no difference between organic and conventional systems. And above that line is an increase in species abundance and richness. And you can see that the organic farms have about 50% more pollinators and about 25% more beneficial predators in both abundance, number, and the richness of how many species there are. And when they looked at herbivores, they didn't see a statistically significant difference between organic farms and conventional farms. So I always think it's really cool when a research study busts a common myth, and that's what this study did. It showed that conventional growers shouldn't worry about their organic neighbors harboring pests because, if anything, they'll actually see benefits from increases in pollinator number and predators. But one thing that always gets skipped over is the why behind the benefits of organic on biodiversity. Most people think that it's just the prohibition of synthetic pesticides, and that's definitely a big part of it, but it's a lot more complex than that. Organic farms also employ practices like crop rotations, cover cropping, intercropping that increase crop diversity, as well as things like hedgerows and flower strips that provide more abundance and diversity of food and habitat for wildlife. They also add carbon to the soil in the form of compost and manure, which feeds the microbial community. So that's all good news. But these studies that I showed you are all done on averages of organic and conventional practices. But not all the practices that I just mentioned are always employed by all organic farmers. And some definitely have a bigger impact on biodiversity than others. The Wild Farm Alliance has done a lot of work identifying and disseminating information on strategies for increasing on-farm biodiversity. And I know that we'll be talking about that later on in this panel, but I just wanted to make sure that I point that out. And it's important to remember that these strategies aren't just to support rare plants or native insects, they also provide direct benefits to organic farmers in the form of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are basically the benefits that are provided to humans from natural and agricultural systems. Things like pollination, clean water, climate stability, pest and disease management, nutrient cycling, even cultural things like spiritual connection or recreation. And biodiversity, both above and below ground, provides important ecosystem services that support the whole system balance that organic farming relies on for success and profitability. When biodiversity provides a whole system function, a farmer can receive a lot of benefits. So things like reduced reliance on inputs to manage soil fertility, reduced pest management costs that are associated with the control of pests and soil diseases, better pollination, healthier soils, more reliable sources of clean water. And those benefits translate into increases in crop yield and stability. And in addition to the benefits that directly impact crop yield, robust on-farm biodiversity translates to community benefits as well. Vegetative diversity, and that includes crop diversity, both in the form of polyculture and crop rotation, all the way down to microbial diversity, contributes to healthier soils. And healthy soils means increased nutrient cycling, more carbon storage to mitigate climate change, better water holding capacity that reduces erosion and increases tolerance to flooding and drought, and more filtration of pollution that results in cleaner water runoff. So in essence, a lot of the biodiversity that benefits the farmer also benefits nearby communities and society as a whole. And when it comes to how these ecosystem services translate into farmer profitability, there have been a lot of estimates that look at all of agriculture. So, for example, one study estimated that ecosystem services from pollinators alone are worth $190 billion per year in the United States. There was also a cool study looking at the value of ecosystem services in organic agriculture specifically, and they estimated that the total annual economic value of ecosystem services in organic fields ranged from $650 to almost $8,000 per acre per year. But there have also been studies that directly tie the practices that increase biodiversity to farmer profitability. So in the top graph on this slide, you see the type of cropping system on the vertical axis, and then the amount of profitability on the horizontal axis. So you can see that the more diverse a cropping system, the more profitable that system is. And then the second graph looks at rotation length and shows that the longer rotation length you have, the more profitable your farm is. And these are also mirrored in biodiversity. So the same practices that you're seeing here are giving increased profitability are also the same practices that give increased biodiversity. So when you manage for biodiversity, you're not just taking care of the environment, you're also supporting your own bottom line because you can see direct gains in profitability from enhanced biodiversity. So thank you guys so much for having me on this panel, and I'll pass it on to the other panelists now.
So actually, I'm going to stop sharing this, my presentation, and I'm going to now open up Peter's presentation. And there you go, Peter. Oh, wait, sorry. Let me, I need to do the slideshow. Here we go.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to join you all and talk about biodiversity on the farm. It's probably one of my favorite questions on organic questionnaires. And I would, can you go to the first slide, please, Joanne? So I call my farm Fresh Run Farm. It's located, we're located just north of the town of Bolinas here in coastal Marin County. And the ranch itself is approximately 240 acres that our grandparents acquired back in the 1940s. And it's a very unique location because we're sort of sandwiched between the town of Bolinas and the wildlife zone of the Point Reyes National Seashore. And in my lifetime, I've been here in my 50 odd years. The region has undergone a terrific amount of sort of natural restoration as a very intensely used area of land because of the proximity to San Francisco and water transport in the 1800s. It was heavily logged, heavily farmed. Even the last scraps of firewood were stripped off of these hills. And it's been a remarkable journey to be here in a time of sort of a great natural sort of recovery time and to be farming organically at the time. I leased the property from other owners. So of the 240 acres, there are only about 10% of the land is really good for agriculture. And it's this bottom land you see in the picture here. Majority of the property is more like the background. It's all wild, heavily sort of forested in Douglas fir in the higher areas, and then lots of California bay laurel, and also on the east side, more sort of oak woodlands. It's sort of a transition between two zones. I started the farm back in, back around 1995. And I didn't really, I grew up here, so I really knew the wildlife and I knew the land well, but I didn't intend to be a farmer. This land was typically leased out to cattle grazing. And when I was a kid, it was used for what they call in the day, they still call truck farmers. And those guys were growing artichokes and vegetables. And for me, that was a really sort of exciting and inspiring thing to learn about that these guys were growing vegetables here. And I used to grow vegetables in the backyard since I was old enough to grow them. So farming was sort of came into my life after college. And this land, just a little more background, had been developed for farming by a neighbor of ours, someone you'd consider an organic pioneer, Warren Weber. And when I got out of school, I worked with Warren Weber, and I worked there for about 10 years. And most of my time, I did a little bit of everything on the farm. And I think the greatest thing about it for me, at this looking back, was to be part of the Bay Area organic community in those days. We were definitely more of a community than an industry. And a lot of our farmers in those days were very passionate about the ecology and growing food without pesticides, and not as fascinated with the economic opportunity as we were about changing agriculture. So let's get down on the ground and talk about the farm here. This is sort of the main part of the farm. There's a series of small sort of plots and bowls. And this is the first one where you enter the property. And as you can see, that's a typical summer scene. And we have mixed row crop vegetables that are some irrigated overhead that need that. And a lot of it is on drip, and a lot of it is, some certain amount is dry farmed. You can see our packing shed there in the middle, sort of tucked into the willows, which are always trying to engulf it. Currently, for the last 5 seasons, the farm has been, in a wonderful way, we've been partnered with Quince and Cotonia restaurants in and Verjus restaurants in San Francisco, with Chef Michael Tusk and his partner, and in business, and his wife, Lindsay Tusk. And it's been a wonderful thing for the farm to have a home for all of our produce, and to sort of have a mission to grow specific things for specific use. And having done this for so many years, to not actually be out there in farmers market and picking up the phone and trying to sell, compete with my neighbors to sell similar products to the same clientele. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to make the farm very economically stable and do well. And in that process of working with Chef Tusk, I've continued an ongoing relationship with the wildlife on the farm, and that's something I'd like to share with you and tell you why I love answering that question that comes up on the forum about interacting with biodiversity. Can we have the next slide, please? This is just the back part of the farm, the second valley. Incidentally, on the back one, my ranch partner and sister live in the house in the last picture, and my brother lives off to the, you can't see in the picture, but that little shed is part of actually their homestead. And then the field I lease is in the background there. And again, you get the sense that we have these bowls of land with lots of wild land, and tremendous opportunity to interact with wildlife. Next slide, please. This is a great little shot. It's a very tough creature to get in a picture, but it's a mink, and it's being harassed by ravens. And a fellow who's worked for me for several years managed to capture this picture of the mink in full flight, and barely could catch it. It's moving so quickly. But you can see it's coming out of some blackberries. And again, as you noticed in the other slides, we have so much habitat right up against the farm that we have there's a lot of interaction with wildlife. Next slide, please. That's our lunch table, and we always seem to have sometimes it's the same fox, or we'll get a new fox, but they tend to adopt us. And, it can be sometimes a nuisance when you come back and the fox has deposited something like dung on the lunch table and things like that. So, it's a mixed relationship, as any relationship with the wildlife here on the farm. Next slide, please. Okay, so when I think about this question of biodiversity on our farms, one thing comes to mind as I sort of break it out into two ideas. One of them is practices, what you do on an ongoing basis. And the other is, have you done any projects? Because we've done some projects to enhance wildlife and help biodiversity. So we're going to kind of break this down into things that we've done around that. This is a quail nest, and I discovered it in an area that where I typically would have done some weed whacking and brush removal. One of my practices is, you know, when you spend enough time actually on the land, you come to know the, of course, know the creatures that are there, and you also come to understand their patterns and their timing. And like anything else on a farm, they're quite regular. And this would have been in late April or May, and here's a quail nest in this area that I typically, in some course of the year, I'm going to use a weed whacker. Next slide, please. I snuck back there about, I think it was about 9 or 10 days later, and I bent down and I took this shot in there, and everybody had hatched. Next slide, please. So here we go. This is down at the packing shed area that we saw in the first photo of the farm, and that was an older photo. Here we've since installed a greenhouse in the end, but that's the same field in springtime. And this is our cover crop that's about to be mowed down and then, of course, turned into the ground to feed the soil. And again, along the lines of the practices, there are ways to mow fields where you can damage a lot of wildlife, and you're going to damage wildlife, things like mice, regardless. But there are ways to do this so that you're not as destructive. And one thing, of course, is being aware of when the birds are nesting, and you want to get a cover crop knocked down before the heart of the nesting season. So obviously going on the earlier side. And then also, next slide, please. It's also how you take down a cover crop. And a lot of farmers I've noticed over the years on huge farms, when I'm driving through the big valley or even around my neighborhood sometimes, they'll mow in they'll maybe start on the outside and mow towards the center. And that's awful, because all the things that are in there are rushing away from the sound of the machine. Every time you pass, they get away from that line, and they end up concentrated in the middle. And sometimes things, you know, can get caught in there and munched up. If you mow from one side, I have found a lot of the creatures tend to keep moving away, and eventually they find the end. They know you're coming close to the very end, and they get out before they're trapped out there in the middle. So that's just one example of a practice. Next slide, please. This is an endangered species on the farm. This is a red-legged frog who's sitting right on a drip tape, if you look really closely there. And this is up in a field that's adjacent to a wetland and a wildlife corridor that I'll show you later. And this is another thing to be aware of as far as a practice. It's just timing. That late in the season, typically these guys leave in the summer when they've either turned into frogs, gone from tadpoles to frogs in the pond or in a pond somewhere. These frogs are adapted to California where it gets dry, so they naturally go out into dry areas such as these crops, and they will actually live within the crop. So that's just something to be aware of. You know, who's living on your farm, and in the case of an endangered species, you darn well better be aware of it, because there are implications if you are damaging them. And also just aware that they're there, and so when it comes time to do something, you know they're there, and you can drive them out in some cases, or just know it's not a good time to mow. Like typically we're not going to mow that until we won't mow it. Actually, we'll probably wait until late fall when everything's kind of down and look at cover cropping it or something like that. But it's mainly just being aware of who's there and where they are. Next slide, please. Another endangered species on the farm is a northern spotted owl, and we have multiple pairs on the property, up to 3 pairs at times have been seen here. So just an indicator of being aware, that we have a pretty healthy and robust ecosystem if these guys are thriving here. Next slide, please. Western pond turtles, I think they have some kind of maybe a threatened status. I can't quite remember, but years ago when I used to see them in the spring, and I'd see them on a road or something marching away, and I had the kind of the natural, what I consider the natural reaction to think, oh, you belong in a pond. And I pick them up, bring them back to the pond. And typically 2 or 3 days later, I'd see them either back where they were the other time. You know, usually you can recognize them. There'll be a dent in the shell or some reason you know that they're the same one. They'd be out marching. And finally I realized maybe it's not up to me. It's up to them. They go marching. They go maybe find new friends and new ponds or something. But just to be aware. And these guys typically go marching around in the spring. I gather they're probably looking for mates, or I'm not sure what their cycle is. But again, it's, you know, how you interact with the wildlife. And, you know, in this case, we just learned to let them do their thing, and they know what they're doing. Next slide, please. I call this guy tractor hawk. And I'm getting into the sort of the realm, and these are animals that are kind of friends of the farm, and they're animals that help with predation. I have a lot of problems with gophers and mice, as most crop growers would have in a place like this. And this hawk, it may be a different one, I don't know, but there always seems to be one that when I fire up the tractor to go do some work, it shows up, like it comes and lands right next to me. And next slide, please. Here it is. That's an area that I've already mowed this crop. It's the field we were looking at earlier with the cover crop. I don't know that it's the same year. And you can see the hawks over there. It's just come down right next to the tractor. It's probably about 20 feet from me, and it's grabbing a rodent out of the soil there. But it's just interesting. I think that you know, you always think there's this stark line between wildlife and human activity. But the truth is they actually adapt to us and we adapt to them. So, you know, this guy's completely into it when he hears a tractor, he or she hears a tractor and is out there. And we'll get into the more helpful side of these animals in a minute. Next slide. These guys are great. These are great egrets, and they're always out here in winter. Although our main bird like this is a great blue heron, but I just happened to get 2 in one shot here. And they're really helpful mostly with mice in the wintertime. You can see there's an older crop of chard back there. And here in Bolinas, I typically plant chard in the springtime. And it will last all the way into the following March or April before it goes to flower. And an older crop like this, it's been here several months. Lots of rodents have moved in there and made their homes because they're great things to eat. And it's great to have helpers like this come around. So, you know, when I think about, you know, wildlife on the farm that are helpful, these guys come to mind. Next slide, please. All right, this is this year, and this is a problem that I've typically only ever seen in the dead of winter, like maybe around now or February. And what it is these huge flocks of English sparrows come into our area in wintertime, and they are brutal. I'm sure anyone who's grown greens in winter has had some version of this problem. This happens to be broccoli, but I was over at a neighbor's yesterday and observing the skeletons of kale that had recently been, you know, completely defoliated. And this problem for me came up really early. These guys showed up in October this year, which I can only imagine has something to do with the rather extreme drought that we're in right now, because I've never seen them here this early and be this destructive. Next slide, please. So this is a Cooper's hawk, and when I discovered this problem with the sparrows attacking the broccoli so early, I had to do something because it's a crop we really depend on in winter time. And I don't think I invented this by any means, but I somewhere got the idea, maybe I read it somewhere, of putting some perches out in the greens for these guys. So in thinking about it, I realized I have a lot of makings for perches because I have irrigation pipe for growing greens in the summertime. And we put in, we just took the riser off of the pipe and put these T structures on. And within a day or two, the Cooper's hawks were in there amongst the sparrows. And I don't know how many they're catching, but they're creating that predatory sense of fear. And the damage went way down. And the sparrows started going elsewhere. They still go in there, but the damage is almost, it's almost unnoticeable now in the new growth. Next slide, please. There you can just see the the tees attached to the sprinkler risers. They were also attacking this fennel. And I had to cover these baby beets over here on the left because they were, that whole bed had been completely denuded of little seedling beets a couple of weeks before. So I had to start it all over again and protect it from the sparrows. It's usually never a problem in the fall. Next slide, please. This is a Western bluebird and a bluebird box. And since my work joining the board of the Wild Farm Alliance, I became very much aware of these birds and how helpful they can be. I have 2 of the boxes provided by I got from the Wild Farm Alliance installed just last summer. So we're hoping we start to see these guys go to work. And you can see the bluebird's holding some sort of insect in its beak. And I've watched these guys, and they collect masses of beetles and bugs and things you don't want chewing up your crops in their mouth. They'll get a whole stack of these things and then they'll go back to their nest and feed. So having these boxes in the crop fields gives you a wonderful helper in the world of insect pest control that's working all the time for you. Next slide, please. And this is just another thing, you have to, if you do certain practices, say where you leave, if you leave pipes out, things will crawl in them, rodents. This guy crawled in this pipe. I put some water in there, and we had a very frightening interaction there. And I decided that I would wait until morning to start the pipe and let the snake have that territory for the evening. Next. Okay, this area I'm going to mention, this is a wildlife corridor that's between 2 of my deer fenced plots. It's really important, I think, to have, and this is something, of course, you can talk about on your, as far as a practice. And here we have a buck. I've been seeing this buck for years. He's actually getting a little older these days. And you can see a friend of his hiding in the grass over to the right, sticking his head up. You can see the corner of a deer fence back there. And this deer is actually in a wildlife corridor that we purposefully set up. It's right between 2 blocks, large blocks of forest. And it allows the wildlife to move. It has cover, it has trees, and it allows wildlife to move freely between those areas. It's sort of like the bridges you see on highways that let animals move through human infrastructure. Next slide, please. Another guy we come across, we do have badgers here, and this guy was quite a few years ago, but they can do a lot of damage in a field, but it's also great to have them keeping a check on the gopher population in the surrounding areas. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a goat herd that up until last year I've had for many years, probably about 15 years I had goats here. But we got into some predator issues. Next slide. This is a goat that had been attacked and partly eaten by a mountain lion. And this comes down to into the realm of animal agriculture. And besides keeping goats and sheep and chickens, I haven't had extensive livestock on the farm, but enough so that I've interacted with a number of predators, and that's a huge area of wildlife interaction to deal with. And my solution, the game warden showed up, said I could have a 10-day permit to kill the cat and all of that. And for one thing, I didn't know what cat it was, and also that's just not the way to do things. So I actually removed the goat herd, and I've been regrouping around the idea of having this livestock. Incidentally, this lion went on a spree and I think killed over a dozen livestock within about a 3 or 4 mile radius, and has been a neighborhood problem. And my solution to the problem is to back off, take the animals away, and we're going to bring in some livestock guardian animals, probably donkeys and dogs. I'm still researching. Next slide. There's the culprit caught at nighttime. We set up some trail cameras, and we've seen the cat several times, usually in the middle of the night, cruising down the creek. And so anyway, there's the culprit. Quite healthy, eating goat and lamb, great diet. Next slide, please. That's just another shot. We think this might be a younger cat, and that could have been a mother because there was lots of communication between animals. We would hear at night the chirping sound between lions. So we think this might be a cub or a younger animal that that large one may have been rearing. We're not sure. Next slide. Another practice is, or this is actually getting into the realm of projects. These are owl boxes, and we haven't had success. The person who put them up is a neighborhood person who was still figuring out the right places to put them. So we're looking to relocate this one to a better spot that's not as busy. And we're hoping to attract barn owls. We know we have them, but those are such great helpers, as we know, on our farms and ranches. But I think it's important to call out any projects such as the bluebird boxes or these owl boxes that you're doing to work with and encourage wildlife. Next slide, please. Can we play this video? This is our creek, Pine Gulch Creek. And we're gonna watch a steelhead. There's a steelhead that's gonna come into this riffle. We're gonna watch it run the next riffle. There we go. Can we run it faster?
Oh, I don't know how to do that.
It's okay. It's okay. Let's just watch this. It should run this riffle. I can see it's over there in the sort of the left. There you can see it. And there it goes. See it running up that riffle. There it is, going up into the next pool, checking it out. This, I guess you'd call it a school or a pod of steelhead. I heard them in the creek 2 years ago, right about this time of year, mid-January. And I went down, I saw where they were, and having grown up in a creek, Pine Gulch Creek, right next to the farm, with steelhead in it, you learn about if you want to view them. So I went upstream a couple of sandbars ahead of where these guys were and just waited like a tree, and they came through me, and I got to take this film with them. I introduced the steelhead because that's really a project. Fresh Run is one of 3 farms that is irrigating here on Pine Gulch Creek, and I'll make it very brief. But we started working with the National Park Service and other agencies about 25 years ago, and the purpose was to bend our summertime irrigation out of this creek for row crop production and build off-stream storage. And it was a long saga that involved 10 different agencies and lots of go-backs and changes when the fish's status went to endangered. We had to upgrade the project, basically reinvent the project midway through, on and on and on. But I'm so happy that we did the project, and that's huge. If you've done a project like this on your farm, I mean, that's what this is really all about, is helping wildlife. And these are threatened species, and we don't take any water for farm irrigation out of this creek anymore. And so we've optimized the habitat. It's a huge win, both for the farm, because we actually now have a secure water supply instead of worrying about, is it too dry of a day to pump water from the creek, versus here we have, thank you. Here we have our new pond and a source of water storage. It takes water from both the sheet flow of the land behind it, and also we can pump water from Pine Gulch Creek during flood high water stages when it doesn't affect the fish, and charge up this pond. So we get a secure water supply out of this, and the fish get an optimal habitat. Next slide, please. And in the course of building this pond, we had to do some repairs to it, and a crew came in from Chatham up in Sonoma County to capture all of the wildlife that had accumulated in the pond. And the pond had only been constructed and operating. This water had only been in here. It's the very first water that went in there about 3 months before. And next slide, please. In that first few months of the pond's existence, red-legged frog found it, and we had over 400, I think close to 500 red-legged frog tadpoles were in that pond in the first 3 months of its existence. So here we actually created a habitat in an area on a dry hilltop in the middle of, no riparian, no nothing. We created a win for an endangered species in our project. So that's something to be aware of too, that you can have very positive impacts with good projects. Next slide, please. And I'll just mention some of our partners. The property has a conservation easement with the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. And the important thing about that is that when the land trust came in to buy an easement here, they realized that we had a tremendous amount of habitat on the property and a fairly small amount of agricultural land. And we were able to secure an easement with help. You can see WCB, Wildlife Conservation Board, they contributed to the easement part that protected all the wildland as habitat, and it's connected to Point Reyes National Seashore Wildlife Area. So that in effect, we're extending a wildlife, what do you call it, wilderness area right onto farmland, and having, because of a conservation easement. Next slide. And this is just to mention another thing is just doing things for wildlife. Again, joining Salmon Safe. That's allowing, you're letting people come onto the property and look at your habitat and determine that your practices are good or help you find practices that are more helpful to wildlife. So interacting with an organization like Salmon Safe is a great way to get to know, aspects of the habitat that you may not know about your own property, and also to form a partnership that's helpful to both the wildlife and the farm. Next slide. And our RCD, Marine Resource Conservation District, has been really helpful. And by the way, I'm a board member, just a full disclosure, so I'm selling it to you. But we have a really neat thing to look up called the Marine Carbon Project, where we're actually building wildlife-friendly carbon sequestration projects on farms and ranches here in Marin County. And it's great to have partner organizations to help in efforts that help biodiversity. Next slide. And I'll just end it. There's a bald eagle in flight, actually 2 of them in flight over the farm back in November. But these are birds that I hadn't seen since the 1970s in our area. And it's just an indication that our ecosystem's doing pretty well when you have top-end predators like this showing up. Incidentally, I took a video on Saturday. I had a golden eagle, and I hadn't seen a golden eagle here much longer than bald, probably back in the early 70s. Last time when I was a little kid, I saw a golden eagle. But anyway, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. So wonderful to learn more about your farm and the things that you're doing to both support biodiversity and coexist with it. Next, we're going to hear from Sean Peter of CCOF, and I'm going to go up his presentation. Let's see.
I don't see the slide yet.
Oh, sorry. Let's see what.
Just make sure we're keyed up here. I'll go ahead and start though. Well, it's great to be here at Virtual Eco Farm and to share the experiences we've had at CCOF with addressing the National Organic Program requirements for natural resources and biodiversity conservation. I enjoyed that last presentation so much, Peter. Thanks. It's a really inspiring place, and I would say that piece of land is lucky to have you there to keep it good for all the animals. So I'm going to share with you what we do at CCOF to enforce and address the NOP. So let's go to the next slide. And it's kind of an outline of what I'm going to cover. So I'm going to cover the organic system plan and the inspection, and then the inspection checklist and guidance that our inspectors use on inspections, and then what we've done for inspector training to teach them about the importance of this and some strategies for verifying and enforcing, and also some resources that we make available and encourage farmers to use. And then what we do with enforcement when there is a problem or an issue that needs to be improved and that calls for action. So let's go to the next slide and I'll jump right into the organic system plan. Let me turn my time. Excuse me. Just gonna keep track of my time here. Yeah, so as Joanne mentioned earlier, and probably a lot of you are aware about what the organic system plan, or we call it the OSP, that's a very central part of organic certification because it's where the farmer or handler or producer, any type of production, outlines what they're doing, how they're complying with the organic rules, and what their systems and practices are. So starting about 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, we created a special section of it just for natural resources and biodiversity. And prior to that, we didn't really have it. It didn't have its own section. And this kind of comes out of the way that the rule is written. It has separate sections for farming practices and handling practices and stuff. It doesn't actually have its own section for natural resources, but it's mentioned in the rule. But it is a central part of the rule. And so we developed this, and in no small part due to the assistance and urgings of the Wild Farm Alliance. And we actually worked in partnership with Joanne to make this better. And so we appreciate that. And it's been really a great partnership that's helped a lot over the years. So this covers this, I realize it's too small and I'm not going to read all through it, but it asks the farmer to describe what their natural resources are, what's on their operation, and then any conservation plans that they have going, what they're doing with non-crop habitat, water management, pollinator and beneficial insect management, invasive species, barriers to free movement of wildlife, mitigation of loss of wildlife habitat. So all these different aspects. And so that's it's 2 pages long. This is just showing the first page. So that was a big step forward. And we improved that a lot too. We went back and redid it and made it better about 3 or 4 years ago. And again, got some feedback and assistance from Joanne, which has been really helpful. And then there's some really passionate young folks at the CCF office who were really interested in this too, and they formed a committee and worked on these documents. You know, it's regulations, so the documents, it's not as exciting as looking at slides of actual things, but it's what we have. We have to work with, and so it's important that it's as well done as possible. So let's go to the next slide and see what we've got. Yeah, so then kind of hand in hand with the organization plan is the inspection checklist. So the inspector goes out for an annual inspection, and they complete a checklist. And so it's a guide that requires them to address certain things in certain ways. And so one thing that we have in our checklist is we have these memos, which are basically guides. So the basic question, like 3.6.02, there's a question there that they need to answer. Is there a conservation plan? Is it accurate? And it references the NOP. But then in italics, there is a memo. So it's basically guidance that's in their face or available at all times. And so for the natural resources, because it's a trickier area to enforce as a regulator than something that's black and white, like what materials did you use? How are the borders and buffers? That can be a little gray too, but you know, some things are very black and white and some things are. So we wanted to provide some guidance and some approaches for inspectors to get a handle on this. And so this is just an example of some good guidance in here that basically encapsulates a lot of the training. But so that's important. And let's see, let's go to the next slide and see what we've got. This is, I think, another part of that checklist. The checklist with all the memos about a page long. I'm not going to read through all this, but you can see that each one of these have guidance that explain what we're talking about and what to look at with non-crop areas. There's some red flag indicators that are given there. So this helps inspectors a lot, keep them focused and give them something to work with. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And then, yes, this is just back to the outline. So now I'm going to talk a little about inspector training that we've done. And next slide, please. Let's see if this is, oh, actually, this is, well, I was going to talk about inspector training and farmer training, so I'll just kind of do it all at once. But this is actually a page on our CCUF website. You can find this by Googling CCOF natural resources, because I guess millions of people aren't Googling that worldwide. You don't get any advertisements. It just takes you right to CCOF. So easy to find. And so this is where we make resources available to farmers, and we refer them there actively too. So especially if there's issues or we're finding that that we have questions or issues, we think there's sort of borderline or there's problems with their compliance with natural resources, we try to refer them to these pages. And we also, when we send back, like after an inspection, let's say there's a problem with how they're managing a riparian area and they need to make improvements there. And so we'll engage in some back and forth with them, asking them to describe how they're going to do it better and blah, blah, blah. But we'll also attach actual pamphlets and things that provide resources where they can get help. We can't roll up our sleeves and be the consultants, but we can refer them to helpful resources, such as you can see here, there's some Wild Farm Alliance brochures there. Okay, so let's just stop there because I think my next slide. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about what we have done with inspectors. So we had Joanne come to one in-person training a few years back and give a full presentation about wildlife and biodiversity on farms, and that was great. And then we followed that up ourselves almost annually with some kind of a shorter training where we remind inspectors what it is. We summarize and go over the NOP guidance 5020, which is a really important guidance that Joanne mentioned earlier. And then we just remind them of all these tools and how it's important and we want them to do a good job. And so that's something that we continually do. As you saw, we provide that guidance right in the checklist. And also something that we've done that's been really interesting is we've created these natural resource focused inspections. So we'll take an annual inspection on an operation that's having a renewal. So it's not like we wouldn't do it on a brand new operation, and they have reasonably good compliance or good compliance overall. And we'll create a different kind of checklist that opens up more time to spend on natural resources. And then we'll minimize some of the other things just that year. And it gives the farm inspector a chance to focus on these issues and spend more time at the inspection. Because there's a lot of other things we have to cover. You know, that's not our mission is not purely natural resources. I mean, it is in the broader sense that organic is environmental, but we've got to go through all sorts of things that are important for organic integrity. And so, you know, it's a pie that has to be broken up all the time. And so we're able to take these inspections and have inspectors have a chance to focus more, and then hopefully bring that to every inspection in terms of better capability to have conversations that are productive with farmers to verify natural resources. And then we've also provided inspectors with like hard copies of the Wild Farm Alliance publication, the continuum chart. They can always get it online, and we make all those links available and everything. But at some point we helped to have some printed, and we mailed them to our inspectors in little piles so they could use them themselves and also pass them out to farmers. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about enforcement. There's some different ways to approach this. It's not something I had on the top of my head, like when Joanne asked, well, what do you do when there's, have you ever decertified anyone? That's a classic question that you get, which great question, a fair question. So I did a little research and I went and looked at in our database, this is just a snapshot of the past 2 years, and there's action items. So lingo for just any sort of a compliance issue that we're going to memorialize in the review and send back to the farmer. So we've had 1,425 of these that regard in some way natural resources. A bunch of those are for record keeping because there's a requirement that they keep records, and sometimes that's a part that is tricky for them, or they, they're like, what records? Like I'm supposed to write this down, and so we help. We make them aware, help to make them aware of ways to do that are pretty easy to do. Actually, my latest greatest idea is like start an Instagram account for your farm, and so you keep your family stuff and your personal stuff somewhere else. It's free, right? An Instagram account, and then you can just take a picture, and it's sort of, you can keep your own folders, but who keeps folders, right? You just take a bunch of pictures and they all get. So anyway, that's just I think that'd be a cool idea. Then when the inspector comes, they say, oh, well, where's your documentation and your monitoring? Oh, here's my Instagram account. And then it can show whatever it is, in Warren, in Peter's case, it could be all these great pictures of bald eagles, and some other, in a lot of farms, it might just be their cover crop and the flowering cover crop. Maybe they caught a picture of some animals or some birds. So that's the monitoring part. Okay, so back to the enforcement. So then about 470 were for actual practices. About 161 of those were more serious. In other words, they required immediate action, a response, or a corrective action. And these get escalated if the farmer doesn't respond. And then 34 were non-compliance, which is yet more serious of those. It has to be addressed and corrected. And there were 2 suspensions that I found. Now this is just a snapshot. And also I was asked, have there been farmers who have left CCOF because of the way we enforce this? In other words, they felt like they didn't want to comply or something like that. So, and that's hard to answer because there's a churning of new people coming in and new operations going out in the hundreds per year, and we don't know all the reasons why they come and go. But anyway, that's a bit about our enforcement. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you an example of some. So this is the soil was left bare, and the inspector noted the concern of erosion because they're leaving the soil bare during the fallow periods. So let's go to the next slide. And then they were issued a compliance action item condition, which requires a response. And this just describes, sort of summarizes what happened, and they were asked to describe how they were going to do cover cropping on this bare land. So, we went after them, and they will be required to improve that. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of where an inspector reported that a quarter acre of wetland is not in production. And the inspector didn't think that the way that they were managing this wetland was really maintaining the wetland. So let's go to the next slide and see what CCOF did. So this was actually a milder one, and I think a milder form of compliance, even though, you'd have to be there to see site specific. I don't know what this looked like, but they were gonna, have to change how they manage this, and then it was going to be checked on the return trip. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's see what we've got there, because I'm almost out of time. Yeah, so I just have some general considerations in thinking about this. You know, what are other certifiers doing? Actually, because that question might come up. Just so you know, I don't know. That's not my job to know. I know what we do. What is the accreditation process doing? So that's the National Organic Program accredits all the certifiers, and so they come inspect us and make sure that we're following the rule and doing all the things we're supposed to be doing. What are they doing about natural resources? I don't know. I'm not at those meetings. I've never heard that CCOF has been cited for anything, though I think we do a relatively good job on this. I don't know if they're enforcing it on certifiers who are doing a lot less. Joanne's done a little bit of studying of that and trying to look at that. I think it's not easy to parse out. But these are just questions I raised. They're sort of the elephant in the room, because if we want the whole country to be doing better and all the certifiers to be doing better, the NOP is the one with the enforcement power over the certifiers. And then just to point out that there's such a wide variety of farm circumstances, and in terms of natural resources, financial resources, very site specific. And so we really think it's important to look at what are we starting with. You've got farms where there's a lot of wildlife and a lot of opportunities, and that's fantastic and that's ideal in a lot of ways. And then you've got farmers who want to, they're leasing a parcel maybe in a place where it's fence row to fence row, or it has been fence row to fence row farming. They want to be organic. That's good, right? And what are they required to do, or what can they do? And they can do some things, and they can manage the resources that they have in a way that maintains and hopefully improves certainly the soil, the water. Ideally, they can have some biodiversity built in there with cover crops and such, and perhaps more. So we have to be a little gentle there in cases like that. We can't really force them to plant a permanent hedgerow necessarily, especially if they're leasing. This could be a larger conversation. Perhaps the landowner should be required to invest in that, but we certainly can raise the question, have a conversation with them, and cite them if they're actually destroying habitat and such like that, and also give them ideas about, hey, this could help you too, like having every 20th row be a flowering plant could really help your pest management, things like that. So trying to incentivize it in positive ways as well. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, you know what? I had a couple more slides you can just go through real fast. Next slide. Okay, so this is a farm with a lot of, they have a nice big hedgerow. They've got enough space, enough land. They own the land, and they do some great stuff with that. And let's look at the next one, please. This farmer has a creek running through. He's very engaged in maintaining the natural environment. I didn't ask his permission. If some of you know who he is, he's important farmer in the area here in Dixon, and does some great work because he's got a lot of natural resources too. And because look at the next one, and this is up in Sonoma or Mendocino, and it's a grape operation, wine operation that also has woodlands and some open land. Let's look at the next one. This will be the last one, and this is that's our inspector with the pad of paper, and that's the farmer there, and she's leasing this land in Hollister. And she's they have a discussion about where there is a little bit of wildland, some trees and things like that. She's not in a position to necessarily plant hedgerows and things like that, but within, so it's just a really different circumstance. And so within that circumstance, we'll have that conversation and see what the farmer can do or is doing to maintain and improve natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That was wonderful. It's wonderful to hear how CCOF has evolved over time to really look at this subject, and it's not just window dressing. You are following it through all the way. I just want to mention that this farm worked with Xerices Society for Invertebrate Conservation to put in some pollinator hedgerows, as I recall. So even though she was leasing, it made sense because she got some support, both financial and technical support on how to do that. So I'm going to, let's see, end this slideshow, and now my slideshow. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. So back in 2005, we published the document on the left, the first edition of Biodiversity Conservation Organic Farmers Certifiers Guide, and mailed it to about 8,000 growers back when nobody was really using email. And since then, we published a second edition in 2016, right around when the NOP published their Natural Resource Biodiversity Guidance. And that's, all of these documents are available on our website for free to download. The middle document we published a year later, and it looked at, or we surveyed organic certifiers, organic system plans to see how they were doing, because we knew now that the guidance was up or out, that that not all certifiers, OSPs, were doing enough. And so, excuse me, so thought, let's figure out where we're at with that. And then this document on the right I'm gonna talk about is the latest document. I'll get to that. Oops, let's see. So one of the things that the NOP's guidance document really elaborated on is that it's more than just protecting soil and water quality, because for years, what certifiers would say to us is, well, look, we are doing this soil water quality verification. We're not really sure we have to do anything else. And the NOP said, no, it is more than that. So that was really good to find out. In the survey I mentioned, we surveyed, or we looked at the organic system plans from around 40 of the 48 OSPs in livestock and cropland. And the green in these pie charts is excellent, blue is good, yellow is fair, and red is poor. And so you can see that the excellent and good, it's about 8% of the OSPs actually were addressing biodiversity well. And that was compared to Wild Farm Alliance's generic OSP that we've created. And a certifier would get an excellent if they had 50% of the topics we thought should be addressed. So we were really generous with this survey, and still look at how poor the OSPs were doing as it relates to biodiversity. And that it's looking at both soil, water, and wildlife habitat issues. In the cropland OSP on the right, you can see we're doing better with about 24% when you add up the excellent and good in for biodiversity and cropland. And that had a lot to do with they were more certifiers were addressing soil issues. In that document, we did not want to beat up on organic. We wanted to push for change. And so we had identified that there are a bunch of great questions in the OSPs. So this is for soil biology and conservation. And you can see these different certifiers. We highlighted some of the questions we thought were right on. This is for wildlife and habitat protection, some examples, and for water conservation and quality, some examples. And you can, as I said, download this off our website if you want to see more. So this latest document is our positive organic indicators and red flags, inspecting for natural resources and biodiversity on farms. And Sean was helpful in reviewing an earlier draft of this. And we also worked with Tony Fleming, who is a great naturalist and has done lots of inspections. And so you can see it's covering all types of operations, cropland, livestock, wild harvest, and handling operations. And we point out the positive indicators like managing for biodiversity would be that a farm is mapping their conservation areas, or a farm is working with NRCS or other conservation programs. And a red flag would be, of course, destroying habitat and or allowing invasive species to move into habitat and eventually dominate. So another example for positive indicators, this is for soil biodiversity and conservation. The farm is protecting non-crop areas with plant cover, and or an indicator would be seeing ground nesting bees. Some red flags are when there's no buffers along waterways, the soil is without appreciable biological activity, and there's evidence of wind erosion and water erosion. Some positive indicators for biodiversity and annual and perennial cropping systems is intercropping flowers into the crop system, and or for perennial or using perennial habitat like this hedgerow. Red flags if crops, say like lettuce, is repeatedly grown without interruption, that's a problem. For perennial crops, if there's no other habitats, for instance hedgerows, that's a problem. It could be cover crops, like Sean had mentioned earlier. For positive indicators for maintaining riparian areas, in this situation, the grower is restricting livestock access. And not all growers have to do that, but that is one indication. What we don't want to see is that livestock have denuded the waterway on the left, and or this pond, the riparian area on the right. Some positive indicators like Peter was talking about, he's going to get some guard animals, like possibly a guard dog, to protect his livestock. And a red flag is that predators are killed without first using some kind of preventative coexistence methods. And or there's a lack of biological diversity on the landscape, which reduces the availability of prey other than the livestock for predators. So I'm not going to go into the whole depth of that document, but as you could see, that we are trying to help inspectors and the certification reviewers understand how to interpret the landscape for biodiversity. Other resources besides our resources, the NOP has an organic integrity learning center, and they've just added training for natural resources and biodiversity that Oregon Tilth put together with NRCS. And so I highly recommend going there and going through that training. Other kinds of resources for farmers are the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. They will give technical and sometimes financial support to put in conservation practices. So or the resource conservation districts, sometimes called soil and water conservation districts, can also be a great resource for farmers. And there are programs that sometimes will support farmers with technical and financial assistance. Like here in California, we have some climate smart programs that help with putting in hedgerows at times when the funding's available. And there's other kinds of projects where farmers can apply for putting in monarch habitat or pollinator habitat and get that support. So that.
All right. Well, that concludes our presentation, and I'm gonna actually hand it.
Hello, everyone.
Oops, I'm sorry. Hand it back over to Joanne, who's gonna lead our live discussion with our panelists. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will try to get to all of them as well. So I'm going to hand it over now.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. Yeah, so we have our 3 other speakers here to talk to all of you and to kind of discuss this together, this topic. And again, they are Jessica Shade from the Organic Center, Peter Martinelli from Fresh Run Farm, and Sean Feeder from CCOF. And I am Joanne with Wild Farm Alliance. And so Jessica, you gave some really great examples about research showing that making farms more biologically diverse helps with multiple benefits. There's better pollination, better pest control, better water quality and soil health. And the rotation story, that was really cool. The longer the rotations, increase profits. So what we've found that when growers are new to biodiversity, that they shouldn't just try and do it all at once, but take steps one at a time. Like trial a small acreage, or instead of doing something on the whole farm, or start with small investments like putting in annual flowers like Sean talked about, the alyssum, instead of right away a perennial hedgerow, or increase your rotations. But there's still some constraints growers are facing. And one of them that we feel really a lot in this area, I'm in the central coast of California, is food safety. And I know there's some research that that counters some of the misguided food safety conceptions. And I was wondering if you could share that with us, Jessica.
Yeah, sure. So as Joanne mentioned, there are these disparities between practices that improve on-farm biodiversity and then requirements from third-party food safety standards. And there's this myth out there that increased biodiversity can confer food safety risks. And, you know, I've spoken with farmers who say that to pass third-party food safety standards, they've had to do things like remove their hedgerows, you know, or basically any non-crop vegetation near their fields, or erect fencing to prevent wildlife from entering their fields. And there was actually this really great article that came out last year in the journal Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. And I will put a link into the chat so that people can see it. And that article kind of highlighted the tug and pull
between biodiversity support and third-party food safety practices that you mentioned. And they document how food safety reforms caused about 13% of riparian habitat along the Salinas River to be removed over 4 years. So these food safety requirements are having real world implications for the environment and for habitat on farms and biodiversity. And the most frustrating part of this is that the science does not support the connection between biodiversity and food safety risks. And in fact, it kind of shows the opposite. There's been research showing that increased biodiversity and a healthy functioning ecosystem can actually suppress foodborne pathogens. And there have been several studies that look at it. And one of my favorite, I'll put this one in the chat too, shows that organic farms that foster biodiversity support these beetles and bacteria that feed on feces, which actually suppress human pathogens. So basically they found that by fostering biodiversity, you're supporting an ecosystem service that has direct benefits to protecting food safety. And this has been, this tension between food safety regulations and biodiversity is not new. And it has really impacted a lot of farmers, but there hasn't really been this cohesive analysis for what that means for organic and the challenges that it imposes on farmers. So the Organic Center actually just got a grant from the USDA last year to do a full assessment of the organic sector. And so we're putting together a survey that we're going to be sending out within the next week. So everyone, check your inboxes, that is for organic stakeholders, including organic certifiers, just to start documenting the stresses that are associated with these third-party food safety standards.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, well, what we try and encourage growers to do is at least plant those annual flowering plants in the rows where they would have had spinach or lettuce or in between them, because how can a food safety inspector not like that? So it brings some biodiversity in, but there is a bigger problem, and that is that not all people see habitat as something valuable. And I wanted to ask Peter, you have such a beautiful farm and you've worked really hard to keep it that way. But some growers, not just the food safety auditors, but some growers look at habitat and they don't see its value. They think it's wasted space. And so how do you think growers can reset their perspective, and or what are some of the steps that they could take to become more biodiverse or have a better understanding of biodiversity on the farm?
Well, that's a great question. And as was mentioned earlier, there are some people that are hemmed in to rental situations where it's fence to fence too. So there are those kinds of constraints. But I think that I don't know. To get at that question, I think the more we can demonstrate that it works and demonstrate the benefits of allowing the wildlife to be on the farm and not trying to force it away or keep it away, is probably the way to go. Is to get people excited out on farms where these things are working and see them and then think, gee, I can do that back at my place or where I'm renting or whatever it is.
Yeah, and what's great is that CCOF is not for their growers, or maybe they do, or maybe they should think about that with their growers, but I was getting to, they are helping to educate their inspectors about biodiversity. And we were part of that maybe a year and a half ago, where we helped with did a tour with IOIA, taking inspectors out to the farm to see biodiversity. And some were CCOF inspectors. And Sean, CCOF is doing a really great job at addressing natural resources and biodiversity, not just with your OSP, which people can download, but also with your inspection report, which I am totally psyched about. And in fact, Sean, you had said that it would be okay for us to upload a piece of that inspection report, the part that relates to natural resources, and make it available to everybody on this in this session. And so we'll have it up for about a month or so, and we'll send you a link with a link for this whole recording afterwards in the next few days. But at the beginning of your natural resource biodiversity section, in the inspection, or the beginning in the inspection report, the inspector is reminded of many things. And I was wondering if you could go over those, Sean, because I think they're really, really important. And I have a feeling there's a lot of certifiers out there that have updated their OSPs, but they really haven't gone that second step, as we were talking about earlier, of like, how do you actually do this on the farm? So could you go over what do you tell the inspectors when you're when they're preparing to be out there on the farm with the farmer?
Yeah, sure. Well, we in our guidance there in that checklist at the beginning, there's sort of some general guidance about how to approach it, and I've got that some of that here, so I'm going to look over to the side here just to prompt myself. But one of the things it says is that seek to engage the farmer in constructive, open-ended dialogue about the natural resources of this operation. And, you know, that's something that I try to encourage inspectors to do about all sorts of things, like about soil management and pest management, to have a broad conversation, like what's the overall picture here, before getting maybe into the details and breaking things up into little pieces. So that's one thing. Just try to have a conversation about it and keep it open and constructive. And then some more specific questions is, what is the impact of this farm on wildlife and on conservation of the soil and water and habitat? So we're just giving some suggestions to inspectors, empowering them and giving them some tools to have some good conversations and to assess compliance by having these conversations, as well as looking around and making direct observations. I mean, you have to remember the inspector's only there one day out of 365 days, right? So it is really important that they're there to actually directly view what they're viewing on that particular day. And they can see a lot, but they really are only seeing a fraction of what's going on that farm all year round. And so skilled interviews, as well as looking at records that the farmer hopefully has that can demonstrate compliance at other times. So, you know, it's important to have these conversations and not just look at, oh, I see this right here, right now. Well, that's important, but also let's have a talk about what happens here all year round. So thoroughly describe any evidence of degradation of natural resources. So we're just reminding them, hey, if there is an egregious or clear problem here, take the time to gather the evidence of that. As needed, discuss with the operator specific plans for improvement over time. Photographs are encouraged. Yeah, photographs can be helpful for a lot of things like that with inspections. So if there's erosion or degradation of habitat, hey, the inspector's gonna describe it in the report, but we do encourage and use photographs. And then we've got red flag indicators, which Joanne helped us to develop too. And those are provided within the different questions. And so we introduced that in the first question, and just that there's these red flag indicators are provided as guidance and assessment tools. They suggest situations which indicate the need to look more closely. Presence of an indicator does not necessarily mean there's a non-compliance. We're just reminding them because they're indicators, but they're not necessarily in and of themselves non-compliances. And examples of helpful questions and approaches: what wildlife do you see on your farm? Residents or passing through, seasonal or constant? what benefits do you see from your conservation practices or from XYZ practices? For example, hedgerows or flower plantings, cover crops, native trees. So encouraging the inspector to facilitate and encourage the farmer to have a discussion about it and open up and provide information and a picture of what's going on there. Yeah, and some questions about the soil too, which is really important and central to organic farming too. And as I said earlier, for farms that maybe don't have a lot of non-crop habitat and don't have wild spaces, then one of their main natural resources is the soil after all, and that's central to organic farming too. So we always keep that in mind and ask them about what their soil management program is.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And that, what you just described is the beginning of the natural resources section. That is not even the actual, there's about a dozen OSP questions with multiple checkboxes that then the inspection report reflects on all of those questions and goes into more detail, which we'll get to in a minute. But Jessica, you know, Sean was talking about engaging with the farmer and finding out the whole story, and you know a lot of science related to biodiversity, but what are some, like, I don't know, talking points or good stories that inspectors should have in their back pocket to be able to share with growers?
Yeah, you know, I have those stats that I put in my presentation, and they're definitely compelling to some people, especially people like me, scientists. But most of the farmers that I talk to, they want to hear about the experiences that other farmers have with biodiversity benefits. And I'm not saying that farmers aren't interested in the hard numbers. Actually, most farmers that I talk with want to read the full scientific studies that I mentioned. So if you're gonna cite a statistic, make sure you have the full citation to share. But also gather those stories from farmers who have done it well and their experiences on how increasing biodiversity has impacted their farms. You know, there's so much risk with trying new things, especially for organic farmers, that it's completely understandable that some growers would be a little bit hesitant to try something just based on academic statistics. So connecting farmers with those who are implementing biodiversity conservation successfully, talking about their experiences, things like that might actually have a bigger impact than just citing statistics alone. And I'm sure that most people, you know, on this webinar probably have seen it done well and have seen those experiences pay off. So if you kind of collect those as your talking points, that's probably more successful than just the statistics alone. But feel free to, you know, use the statistics in my presentation. If you have any questions about the studies that I cited, let me know. I'm happy to send you the actual citations. But yeah, that's my advice.
I like that advice. Yeah, we all operate really with stories, right? And if you're trained or you're patient or patient, then the statistics can tell a story, right? Statistics and a study, and they do. But yeah, real stories, and that's good to think about in terms of, yeah, go ahead.
And as you probably all know, that's also the way that you help encourage adopting best practices just in general. Every time that I go to a field day where farmers are actually there talking about their own farms, it has a lot bigger impact than when I go with, you know, my little presentation and I talk about what the academic researchers have found. It's really a lot more impactful when I bring a farmer that we've worked with, because most of the research that we do now happens on farms. And I can be like, why don't you talk about your experience with these practices rather than me just talk about the scientific results?
I'll toss something in. I always think about how inspectors in a certain region, particularly ones that are more regional and not covering larger territories, but larger territories too, for that matter, they see a lot of diversity in different ways of doing things. And I know it's to some degree they can't be too much of an advocate, but I think can't they simply say, hey, this person over here has got a really good solution to your problem you have, and that kind of at least mild suggestion of, you know, people that can be referenced for a particular problem.
Yeah. Inspectors have to be careful not to provide specific advice in consulting. Like, I think you should do this particular practice, or, you know, because they're there to verify compliance. They need to stay on their side and not kind of get next to the farmer and start solving their problems specifically. But that said, it's part of the, first of all, it's part of the inspector's duty under the rule to actually inform about what the rule is and what the requirements are, so they can do that fully. And then they can make general references, and we have encouraged them to do that and try to make them aware of that, how to do that line. And if you're concerned about confidentiality too, because they're under confidentiality agreements to respect the confidentiality of all the different farms that they see. So they wouldn't want to refer to a what the farm is if they're saying, well, I saw this particular practice. They wouldn't want to say, I think you should do this particular practice, but they could say, you might consider, or I saw this, or you might look into this, and just keep it general.
Thank you.
But you're right that an inspector oftentimes does have that experience, the more wide-ranging experience of seeing a lot of different farms, and that is helpful. You know, they can maybe cross-pollinate in general ways. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
It seems like CCOF has gone through this evolution where, not all of your inspectors were understanding and able to do a good job of implementing this inspection report, but over time, that has changed. And I was wondering if you just had some pointers for other certifiers. I know you talked about training, Sean, but are there other things you could say, like, what did you learn from? What were some of the things, the stumbling blocks that you could share with others?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that's covered in my talk that we saw. It's having the infrastructure there too, in terms of the organic system plan. So I would encourage certifiers to take a look at their natural resources section of their organic system plan, and we'll share ours. We're happy to share that. And there's some other good models out there, I'm sure. We're not the only ones, I'm sure, who have good ones. And there's, so look at that and look at the checklist questions, think about guidance, and then really just telling the inspectors that it's important to you as a certifier. And so we remind our inspectors of that. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've done, and providing links and encouraging them to seek additional training on that. Hey, I'm pretty sure that the National Organic Program, they have this Organic Integrity Learning Center that they've launched in the last couple of years. It's really great. And there's a lot of good training for certifiers and for certification. And they have a module now on natural resources, which I'm trying to wedge into my calendar. I'm going to see that really soon. I haven't seen it myself yet, but I'm going to see it soon and take that training. But that's another place. Yeah, tell the cert. We actually have continuing ed requirements for our inspectors too. And so like we're promoting those organic integrity learning centers. So yeah, encouraging, just telling them and bringing it up again, you know, reminding them that it's important, and building the infrastructure to be able to collect that information and have meaningful inspections around this topic.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool that you said some of the younger people in CCOF wanted to form a committee or did form a committee about this topic.
Yeah, there's a whole team of reviewers who review inspection reports and review organic system plans and applications, you know, to make certification decisions. And yeah, there's people who are really interested in this. And that's really why, maybe at some level, why a lot of people are interested in, or one of the top values of organic farming, right, is environmental. And so, yeah, there's some people who care. And they formed, I guess I used the word committee. It's not quite the right word, and it makes it sound kind of stuffy. I was the one who used it originally. It was more like a working group so that they could develop their own abilities to read these reports and then and create these action items and conditions and compliance language that would be effective. So they spent some time to focus on that and work through that specifically on natural resources and biodiversity.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna go back to Peter. And Peter, you talked about there's benefits and there's costs to biodiversity. And I was wondering if you could chat a little bit about how do you weigh what you're gonna do, because you know, often I think growers would, you know, if a mountain lion came and killed their goats, they'd be like, I'm going to kill that mountain lion, but you didn't. The sparrows are eating your crop. Growers might say, I'm going to trap and kill those sparrows, but you didn't. You came up with a different solution. Each time you're coming up with different solutions. And I was wondering, you know, how do you do that? How do you step back? I mean, and really, or what's the process, or how would others do that? You know, so that they feel like they're still somewhat in control, but also able to address their issues.
Good question. I think some of that comes from having been doing it long enough. And, you know, my old solution for the sparrows would have been an 11-year-old and a BB gun, you know, and there are solutions for all of these problems. But in the end, I think it's also just developing an ethos of not killing things because they're getting your way or they do something you don't want them to do, and accepting the idea that they live here too. So yeah, and there's a certain amount of you get mad, you know, you go out there and a lot of you might be gardeners, you go out there and you put all this work and effort and you have excitement about something you're going to grow and eat, and all of a sudden somebody else came right at that moment when it was perfect and ate it, you know, and it's just like somebody stole your lunch or something. So I think it's getting over some of that kind of mentality. And I think it's hard to get people to back away from that, you know, and I know a lot of livestock people who are used to be so adamant about you know, whether it's the poison collars or shooting or the coyotes or all of that. And I think getting to the other side where they realize, you know, you have these like most of them like these big fluffy white dogs, the problem's gone. It's just so simple, you know, and you're not out there in the middle of the night chasing an animal around or watching a camera or something. So but I think to your question, it's just spreading the word and you know, kind of again, demonstration and changing the ethos.
Yeah, good. Well, it's so refreshing to hear you talk about it. You know, that there is this reality that you have on your farm, and others can be inspired by that. Yeah, so were there questions from the audience? Shelley, I think you were following some of those, which I haven't been.
I think that there were a couple questions, but it seems like the panelists answered them. But yeah, so I haven't seen anything. There's some good resources being shared in there, but if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat box.
Yeah, and then Jessica, kind of getting or tagging along to what Peter was talking about. Do you have any studies that analyze what it takes for organic growers to make changes?
Yeah, you know, perceptions of biodiversity have a lot to do with conservation adoption. And I feel like Peter really exemplified that with his responses to potentially negative interactions with biodiversity. You know, the way he said that ethos of not killing things, it's kind of this, it's just this, this way of looking at things. And I feel like I need to adopt more of that, since we have a big problem with ravenous squirrels eating our crops at my house. Sometimes I just wish I had a little bit more of that, like, deep breath, zen, but it's really about perceptions and understanding what those perceptions were. And there's this study that came out a couple of years ago that showed that in general, there are different perceptions among different types of growers. So vegetable growers liked the idea of perching birds and bats for pest control, and then raptors for vertebrate control. But fruit farmers had negative attitudes towards perching birds. So really understanding the attitude of the farmer that you're talking about biodiversity with is really important. So what's the perceived risk that's keeping them from implementing biodiversity techniques? Are they worried that the birds are going to eat their crops? Are they worried about foodborne pathogens or attracting pests? Or are they stressed about taking productive land out of commission by putting in something like a hedgerow? And the good news is that organic farmers have more positive views of biodiversity across the board than conventional farms. And there have been a few studies showing this. So we're already starting from an easier place of communication, but it's still important to understand their motivations and perceived risks and kind of start there. Start the conversation where they are and with what they're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Hey, Joanne, there's a question from the chat box. The question is what are some practices for greenhouse only growers or organic nursery plant growers?
Oh, I could take that, but you all can add to it. We know of growers in greenhouses, like if they have container plants, they can plant biodiversity in some of those containers. It doesn't have to be all the crop. It could be plants that are flowering and supporting pollinators and beneficial insects. They can also plant outside the greenhouse, right outside the greenhouse, and greenhouses shunt water, and that can cause erosion. And so directing that water so that it spreads out instead of eroding is really a good way to address a natural resource potential issue, and using plants to dissipate that flow. So there's all kinds of ways that biodiversity can be incorporated into greenhouse production. I wanted to end with asking Sean if he might go through, Sean, in your inspection report, you go through, or there's a question in the organic system plan about habitat for beneficials. Can you go over what the inspection report asks the inspector to address as it relates to habitat for beneficials?
Sure. So it asks, does the OSP accurately reflect habitat management? So it's basically saying, is the OSP accurate? And our And are practices sufficient to maintain or improve populations of pollinators, natural enemy insects, and other wildlife? And that one, yeah, that requires narrative comments too. So we don't just want a check yes on that. And there's a memo that goes with that question. Habitat for beneficials likely ties into non-crop area management, but could also be in-field plantings. For example, rows of alyssum or good bug mix interspersed with the crop, and edge plantings, e.g. hedgerows. So that memo is intended to just give the inspector some ideas about what we're talking about. You know, what kinds of practices could enhance pollinator habitat. This question, consider whether the crop production practices along with the entire land management allows for beneficial organism populations to at least be maintained and not suppressed. Are there simple practices that could be implemented to provide habitat? Refer to the Wild Farm Alliance biodiversity continuum for examples. And red flag indicators, crop and non-crop areas devoid of any wildlife habitat throughout the production season. Practices that kill or endanger beneficial species, whether intended or not. I think your video froze, Joanne.
Yeah, I think she is frozen. There's one last question, Sean, if you have a minute to ask. And it's how does CCOF avoid having a double standard for renters and landowners where the former can do biodiversity light and just use cover crops, and the latter must use more permanent practices? Do you use the spirit of continuous improvement to inform your compliance actions on a farm by farm basis? Kind of a big question.
They answered the question for me. Use continuous improvement. And it really just depends, you know, it's just so site specific. So, you know, the rule says maintain or must maintain or improve, though there was a guidance that was put out that really gave it more teeth and really said that operations must provide some habitat for biodiversity. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that. How do we avoid having a double standard? I mean, they are two different situations. We just have to take them each on their own merit and considerations, you know.
Joanne, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, my internet keeps breaking up. Was the question about maintaining or improving?
It was a question about how do you treat, how does CCOF inspect on different farms, basically farms that are renters versus owners of land. Mhm.
Okay, great, good. Yeah, I think we're a little over time. Are there any other questions or should we wrap it? Is that it?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat box.
So our speakers, Jessica and Peter and Sean, do you have any last thoughts? Something we haven't covered, or do you want to share anything else?
No, but I can put my email address. I'll put it in the chat box, and then if people have other questions or are curious about studies on particular issues, feel free to reach out to me.
Great, thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, likewise, you can find me. I'm Sean at ccof.org. And I'd be happy to share any of the resources that we have with any certifiers or anyone who's interested, if it can help everyone to develop good systems for this, for enforcing the natural resources and biodiversity. So, and thanks, Joanne and Shelley, for putting this on.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sean. I think, as I said earlier, a rising tide rises all boats, and CCOF is really going to help, or is helping with that. And Peter, do we still have you?
Sure, if anyone has questions for me, you can reach me at vegetableman20@hotmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter and Sean and Jessica. It was really great to have your presentations and then have this discussion. And Wild Farm Alliance, myself and Shelley, we're definitely open to helping inspectors and certifiers. Please email us. You can, the easiest way is just info@wildfarmalliance.org. And we'll get it. And there's lots of materials on our website if you just go to resources section. So thank you so much for joining us today.